All right, so hopefully you were able to read the vocabulary for chapter 15. That's what we're going to focus on today. You did have to read chapter 14 on your own. So that chapter was called The Triumph of the Witch. So we know in that chapter, it kind of started off with Aslan, who was not acting himself. So everybody kind of knew that something was wrong. And he even told the kids that, he might not be available for when the big battle happens. The girls are having a hard time sleeping, so they decide, that they wake up and they're talking, then they see Aslan, so they decide to follow him and they talk with him, and he says, "You can come with me just for a little bit, then you're going to have to stop and turn back around." They end up hiding in the bushes, and then they see something horrific happening. The White Witch and all of her followers have captured him. They tie him up, they shave off his mane, they muzzle him, and then ultimately the White Witch tells him, instead of killing Edmund as part of the magic, I'm going to take your life instead. She also lets him know that there's nothing that's stopping me from killing Edmund and the others. So that's kind of where we're at. And, Susan and Lucy witnessed the whole thing, and it was a very, very, climactic part of the story. So we can think of this as the climax, as, oh my gosh, like what's really going to happen with Aslan? Like he just died. Okay. So that leads us to chapter 15, which is called Deeper Magic from Before the Dawn of Time. While the two girls still crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now follow me all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." So we know too that that was part of the conversation that the White Witch and Aslan had back in chapter 13 when they kind of stepped away and had their own conversation. At this moment, the children were, for a few seconds, in very great danger, for with the wild cries and a noise of skirling pipes and a shrill of horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the hilltop and down the slope right past their hiding place. They felt the specters go by them like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs, and overhead there went a flurry of foul wings and a blackness of virtues and giant bats. At any other time they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and shame and horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they hardly thought of it. As soon as the wood was silent again, Susan and Lucy crept out onto the hilltop. The moon was getting low and thin clouds were passing across her, but still they could see the shape of the lion lying dead in his bonds. And down they both knelt in the wet grass and kissed his cold face and stroked his beautiful fur, what was left of it, and cried till they could cry no more. And then they looked at each other and held each other's hands for mere loneliness and cried again. And then again were silent. At last Lucy said, "I can't bear to look at that horrible muzzle. I wonder if we could take it off." So they tried, and after a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold and it was now the darkest part of the night, they succeeded. And when they saw his face without it, they burst out crying again and kissed it and fondled it and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. And it was all more lonely and hopeless and horrid than I know how to describe. "I wonder, could we untie him as well?" said Susan presently. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cord so tight that the girls could make nothing of the knots. I hope no one who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you have been up all night and cried till you have no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes in the end a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing was ever going to happen again. At any rate, that was how it felt to these two. Hours and hours seemed to go by in the dead calm, and they hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last Lucy noticed two other things. One was that the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. The other was some tiny movement going on in the grass at her feet. At first she took no interest in this. What did it matter? Nothing mattered now. But at last she saw that whatever it was had begun to move up the upright stones of the stone table. And now whatever they uh, were moving about on Aslan's body. She peered closer. They were little gray things. Ugh, says Susan from the other side of the table. How beastly! There are horrid little mice crawling all over him. Go away, you little beast. And then she raised her hand to frighten them away. Wait, said Lucy, who had been looking at them more closely still. Can you see what they're doing? Both girls bent down and stared. I do believe, said Susan, but how queer. They're nibbling away at the cords. That's what I thought, said Lucy. I think they're friendly mice, poor little things. They don't realize he's dead. They think it'll do some good untying him. It was quite definitely lighter by now. Each of the girls noticed at the first time the white face of the other. They could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of little field mice. And at last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. The sky in the east was whitish by now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one very big, one low down on the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night. The mice crept away again. The girls cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes. Aslan looked more like himself without them. Every moment his dead face looked nobler as the light grew and they could see it better. In the wood behind them, a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been so still for hours and hours that it startled them. Then another bird answered it. Soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night. I'm so cold, said Lucy. So am I, said Susan. Let's walk about it. Let's walk about a bit. They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked dark gray, but beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red. They walked to and fro more times than they could count between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep warm. And oh, how tired their legs felt. Then at last, as they stood for a moment looking out towards the sea at Cair Paravel, which they could just now make out, the red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. At that moment they heard from behind them a loud noise, a great cracking, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a giant's plate. What's that? Said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I feel afraid to turn around, said Susan. Something awful is happening. They're doing something worse to him, said Lucy. Come on. And she turned, pulling Susan round with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All colors and shadows were changed, and for a moment they didn't see the important thing. Then they did. The stone table was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran down it from end to end, and there was no Aslan. Oh, oh, she cried. Oh, cried the two girls, rushing back to the table. Oh, it's too bad, sobbed Lucy. They might have left the body alone. Who's done it? Cried Susan. What does it mean? Is it magic? Yes, said a great voice behind their backs. It is more magic. They looked round. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. Oh, Aslan, cried both of the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan? Said Lucy. Not now, said Aslan. You're not a, asked Susan in a shaking voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and looked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. Do I look it? He said. Oh, you're real, said Aslan, cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. But what does it all mean? Asked Susan when they were somewhat calmer. It means, said Aslan, that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time, but if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who has committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. And now. All right, so let's talk about that real quick. So there's a deeper magic that Aslan knows about that the witch doesn't. And it's that if somebody was, there was a willing victim, somebody who had not committed any treachery took the place of somebody who did, that the magic would work backwards. Okay, so the witch didn't know that, Aslan did. So all is well, he knew what he was doing. Oh, yes, now, said Lucy, jumping up and clapping hands. Old children, said the lion, I feel my strength coming back to me. Old children, catch me if you can. He stood for a second, his eyes very bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a leap high over the heads and landed on the other side of the table, laughing. Though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled over to reach him. Aslan leaped again. A mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, now letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws, and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly so that all three of them rolled together in a happy, laughing heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one has ever had except in Narnia. And whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay together panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least tired or hungry or thirsty. And now, said Aslan presently, to business. I feel I'm going to roar, and you better put your fingers in your ears. And they did. And Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible that they did not dare look at it. And they saw all of the trees in front of him bend before the blast of his roaring, as grass bent in a meadow before the wind. Then he said, we have a long journey to go. You must ride on me. And he crouched down, and the children climbed on to his warm golden back, and Susan sat first, holding on tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind, holding on tightly to Susan. And with a great heave, he rose underneath them and then shot off faster than any horse could go downhill and into the thick of the forest. The ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that ever happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever felt a gallop on a horse? Think of that. And then take away the heavy noise of the hooves and the jingle of the bits, and imagine instead the almost noiseless padding of the great paws. Then imagine instead of black or gray or chestnut back of the horse, the soft roughness of golden fur, and the mane flying back in the wind. And then imagine you are going about as twice as fast as the fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between the tree trunks, jumping over bush and briar and smaller streams, wading the larger, swimming in the largest of all. And you are riding not on a road, nor in a park, nor even on the downs, but right across Narnia, in spring, down solemn avenues of beech and across sunny glades of oak, through wild orchards and snow-white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing caverns, up windy slopes alight with gorse bushes, and across the shoulders of heathery mountains and along giddy ridges and down, down, down again into wild valleys and out into acres of blue flowers. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down a steep hillside at a castle, a little toy castle, it looked from where they stood, which seemed to be all pointed towers. But the lion was rushing down at such a speed that it grew larger every moment, and before they had time even to ask themselves what it was, they were already on a level with it. And now it no longer looked like a toy castle, but rose frowning in front of them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were fast shut. And Aslan, not at all slacking his pace, rushed straight with a bullet towards it. The witch is home, he cried. Now, children, hold tight. Next moment, the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them. For the lion has gathered himself together for a greater leap than any he had yet made and jumped. Or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of the wide stone courtyard full of statues. All right, so we are now going to be going into our following action of the story. So that climactic part of whether Aslan was going to make it or not has been resolved here. So now we're going to find out what happens after that. So stay tuned for chapter 16, which is coming up next.